Welcome to the Dalí Museum. We're very pleased to have all of you here tonight. And we are here for another edition of the Dalí in Science lecture series. The Dalí in Science series is something that we started actually with Debbie Castle over at USF at her encouragement. And it's a program that focuses primarily on ways of seeing Dalí from particular scientific perspectives. So whether it's DNA, concepts of death, biology, or in this case, psychoanalysis, it provides a lot of different pathways in which we can take a look at Dalí. It's a collaborative program, and for quite a while we were able to work with Debbie Castle on doing specific programs each month. But we've expanded it, and we're very pleased. Last month we had Holly White from Eckerd College. This month we have Velva Heraty, who is a local scientist, doctor perspective on Jungian psychology. And next month we have Francis Tobian, who is a professor at USF St. Pete, who's going to be talking about Dalí in relation to the occult and some of his studies in that area. So we hope you'll continue to support this program. In the spring, we're going to be going for a different program to just take the place of this for, I believe, 5 months. I think we're doing something called Dalí Condensed, which focuses on really our dosing class, and then we'll continue back to the Dalí in Science program in the summer. Well, tonight you're here for a very wonderful treat. We are very, very pleased to have Velva Heraty. She brings a very new perspective to understanding Dalí. And you'll particularly appreciate that after my presentation, which will focus on perhaps the typical approach to Dalí. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about Dalí in relation to Sigmund Freud and how Dalí really is kind of created himself in essentially Freud's image of the damaged or difficult artist in relation to father-son issues and sexual difficulties. The beauty is that Velva is going to be bringing a Jungian perspective, and we'll talk a little bit about those differences, but a Jungian perspective in terms of understanding areas that perhaps we don't talk about Dalí, and the idea of dream from a very different perspective than what Freud offers. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest speaker tonight, who will be following me. Velva Heraty is a certified Jungian depth psychologist, psychotherapist, with 30 years of experience as a private practitioner and an international clinical trainer. She studied at the C.G. Jung Institute in Evanston, Illinois, for 7 years, and was tapped by that city, by the city of New York, as a resource for the National Nightmare Hotline, which was created as a result of 9/11. She is known as the Dream Mama to many of you, I believe, because she's had a long-standing relationship with creative loafing. And she's going to talk a little bit about this, but recently she has finished her book, which will soon be published, called The Dream Belongs to the Dreamer, which will be coming out hopefully in early 2013. So she'll share more of that with you when she speaks. I'm going to relatively briefly give you the encapsulated sort of pseudo-Dalí Freudian perspective to just set the stage, so to speak. So part one, Dalí, psychoanalysis, Jung and Freud. And the first thing to say is that Carl Jung, as many of you I'm sure are aware, was a student or worked with Sigmund Freud, was one of the so-called disciples at a certain point in his career, learning from this very remarkable individual who was really revolutionizing potentially what was understood as the human mind and what's available for a scientist to even study as a ground of research. You can see in 1909, Jung was part of the group coming from Europe that did an American tour. This is a photograph at Clark University. Jung is over here, and here's Sigmund Freud. Bit of a father-son kind of dynamism between the two of them. But you can see that by 1922, 2 years before Surrealism even existed, Jung had already disappeared from the picture. So I think that in terms of timing and alliances, when Dalí starts to be aware of Freud, Freud is the man that he focuses on. He's not really that aware of even the followers or the people who are expanding upon Freud's ideas. Very briefly, and I know this will be returned to in Velva's talk, Freud's perspective was primarily focused on sexual development as the defining force behind human behavior. So everything came down to sexual development and primarily development in the childhood through various stages. The really defining difference and the reason for the break between the two of them is that Jung looked past that and felt there were a lot of other contributing factors, including religion, senses of power, the kind of drives that lead us to want to be better people, that those kinds of things there was no place for in a Freudian concept of development. And for Freud, the classic idea is that the sublimation of the artist's unsatisfied libido is responsible for producing all forms of art and literature, whether painting, sculpture, or writing. So it's that idea of the unsatisfied, unsatiated sort of sex drive that is responsible for everything and anything we think of as being cultural. Very, very broad definition, obviously, but one that Dalí found very appealing. 1924, the classic book, which was really not known except from very, very small circles, The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, was translated into Spanish. And what's, I think, worthy of noting here is that it was translated into Spanish even before it was translated into French. So Dalí, being a student in Madrid, had a lot of, I guess, encouragement from his colleagues to be part of the clique that was aware of and reading this book. And so he was reading it not as a surrealist, but rather as a young, very interested, agitational kind of student. But he was reading it even before the surrealists themselves were able to get a hold of this and see the specifics of what Freud was talking about. The importance of this book clearly is that for the first time there is the proposition that dreams, slips of the tongue, unusual chance encounters, all of these things were worthy for analysis in terms of understanding who we are, what our problems are, and perhaps how we can heal ourselves. So there's this sense that in the past, up until this point, a dream would be just a dream. A dream has no relevance in a clinical institution. Freud turns that on its ear and says, no, indeed, dreams reveal everything. It's the unconscious, the sublimated information from inside of ourselves telling us something very important, and it should be paid attention to, particularly if we want to help individuals who seem to be behaving very strangely as a result of things that happened in their past. Dreams are the avenue to deciphering what the problem is. So this book quietly received for about 10 years, and then suddenly the ticking time bomb explodes, and by 1924 it's already in Spanish, and Dalí, as a student, is reading it at the same time as his future colleagues. Dalí claims that the interpretation of dreams was one of the greatest discoveries of his entire life. He said he was obsessed by the vice of self-interpretation, and he went on to say that it was not just of his dreams, but everything that happened to him. However accidental or strange it may have seemed, everything was available for his imagination and his approach to a kind of dream interpretive analysis. So it's really Dalí wanting to be always engaged as a clinical psychologist, but always available to the kind of madman's fantasies. He wanted those two worlds together. This is a sort of, I guess, the iconic shot of Dalí demonstrating his goals. This is an exhibition in 1936 in London where Dalí came to do a lecture, and he dressed in a deep-sea diving suit. And the reason he did that was because he wanted to basically demonstrate how he was the Freudian analyst diving into the unconscious, exploring all the strange treasures of the unconscious, and bringing them up like a deep-sea diver to the earth and the surface to be seen by everybody very clearly. There's a story attached to this which has no bearing on tonight's lecture, but many of you probably know it, but if you don't, it's actually quite interesting. There was a hose that, of course, brought the air into the deep-sea diving suit. Someone had shut a door on it, and at some point during this performance where you couldn't hear Dalí anyway, he started to flail because he was basically suffocating. The audience in London, who had never seen a Dalí performance before, thought this was all part of the act, and they started to applaud wildly and thought that this was great fun until someone did notice, of course, oh my God, his face is red, and there seems to be terror in his face. They quickly saved him. The resulting situation is that the next day, the write-up about the show was all about Dalí's performance. So there was a lot of unusual situations like this in his life that seemed to be somewhat driven by Freud in a very strange way that always lead to further and further success. This is a typical Dalínian image dealing with the idea of dreams. And he stated at one point that his goal was to bring the world of dreams, visions, and hypnagogic imagery to a tangible, concrete reality. Essentially, he wanted to paint exactly what dreams seemed to be to him in an almost photographic way, so that it's almost the sleight of hand, the ability that he had learned as a craftsman would allow him to convince us of the reality of these impossible visions. And this is an image actually called The Dreamer. Now, very different kind of subject matter that we're looking at here. When Dalí was a child, something very traumatic was exposed to him. And it's possible that it had to do with his father's own past, but Dalí's father was uncomfortable about simply telling his son about the dangers of venereal disease and sexual contact without protection. Instead, what he chose to do was to put a medical text with photographs of the lesions brought about by syphilis onto the family piano and leave them available for him to look at his leisure. The resulting situation, of course, is not, surprising. Dalí became completely freaked out by the idea of sexual contact. To him, this was the apparitions of his worst nightmares that just kept coming and haunting him, and he kept associating this with the act of sex, which leads to a very early state, 1926, 3 years before he's even a surrealist. He's starting to deal very specifically with explicit sexual concerns and fears that he's developing as an individual while he's developing as an artist. He's also very much focusing on the alternative to sexual contact, which is masturbation. And by 1927, this becomes the celebratory flag that he flies. He actually becomes identified with this idea that this aberrant behavior is going to be the main subject of his artwork. So this is artwork from upstairs, and of course, right at the very top, the aberrant red hand, which seems to be flailed, is actually a symbol that he makes clear and repeats over and over again that this is a symbol of masturbation. And he stays at this, this sort of Freudian sexual aberrant stage for about 3 years, from about 1927 through 31 to 32. And then his artwork starts to mature and move in some other different directions. But from about 2 years before he's an official surrealist to about 2 years after he joins the movement, this is sort of the material that he's working with over and over and over again. So much so that by 1929, when he is officially invited to join this French movement, and he goes to France and he makes the movie called The Andalusian Dog, he paints this incredible painting called The Great Masturbator, which is basically a self-portrait, where he is identifying himself as the great masturbator. He has embraced this kind of logo and distinction or emblematic understanding of himself as someone who is aberrant in a kind of Freudian context. And it's true, I think that it's very worthwhile to stop and to pause and say, do we really know that Dalí is suffering from these things? Could it just be, is it just him stating this for shock value? And I think that that's a very reasonable interpretation. I don't think we really know exactly what happens in Dalí's life, but we do know that that's the way to read this material. That's the way he intended it to be understood. Moving to Dalí's colleagues in this group, André Breton, who starts the Surrealist movement, states very clearly that for him, the goal of the movement itself, the goal of Surrealism, whether you're a writer or an artist, is to bring together these two very different states, dreaming and waking consciousness, to provide a much more rich experience of life itself. That we've ignored our dreams for too long. Freud shows us the way. And so he basically is stated as almost an entry into the definition of the whole group itself, that dreams are of incredible value. We are going to explore those, but the ultimate goal is to bring them back to a kind of waking understanding of reality, a new reality. Some of their ways that they explored it was through automatic writing, through dream analysis, through automatic drawing. This is by André Masson. They tried to open themselves up to almost clairvoyant type of avenues to discover what they refer to as the unconscious. They weren't looking for ghosts or to speak to the great-grandmother who's been dead for many years. They were all about trying to find new ways to access this kind of hidden area of the unconscious that may operate very much like our dreaming mind. And so Dalí just fell right into the group in 1929. This is a painting by a particular individual who influenced the group. This is actually from 1914, long before Surrealism ever existed. But Giorgio de Chirico, an Italian painter, came up with sort of the iconic image of the dreaming individual. This is called the child's brain. And the figure that we see here is often interpreted as a kind of father figure. And we have a painting I'll show you shortly called The Average Bureaucrat, which is a father figure very much influenced by this same image. But the idea that the eyes are closed put us in that unconscious dreaming state of mind, which Surrealism embraced. This is our very famous painting, which is gone from our galleries. It's actually at the Pompidou, getting ready for the opening of the big Dalí show in about a week or two. But this is called First Days of Spring from 1929, and this was really Dalí's entry card into Surrealism. This is where he says, I understand everything that you're talking about with your interest in Freud and in dream analysis. This is my contribution to this. This is where what I have to offer. And just the very, very brief discussion of it, it's a collection of many, many different images that don't seem to relate to one another, but that similarly to the way dreams work, we want to force connections between them. And Dalí has placed an image of himself as a child right in the very center of this kind of nightmarish wasteland environment, surrounded by all these different strange activities, some of which are very disturbing, but it's as if he's going back to his childhood and saying, just like Freud says, whatever aberrations I have, whatever obsessions or phobias, it's my childhood where they were formed, and this is essentially a kind of dreamlike self-portrait, letting images well up randomly, but then recording them very quickly and trying to find some sort of a rational dream logic between them. So some of the objects, as I said, they're placed in small huddles. They suggest the dreaming mind, which was one of the things Dalí was able to contribute to the group. And they don't have any logical connection, which forces us to try to interpret them, again, as a kind of a dreamlike solution to understanding what it is we're looking at. But lots of sexual images, lots of childlike images, and even right in the center, let's see, well, I guess I took it out. There's an image that looks very much like Sigmund Freud. Dalí uses Freud's texts, and this was pointed out by one of the scholars that have researched him, Don Addis. He uses Freud in the same way that Renaissance artists were using the Bible. He was so familiar with Freud's writings and so comfortable with them that finally when he met the Parisian Surrealist group, he knew he was amongst others that knew Freud as well as he did, and he took it for granted that this is just the way that people were understanding art. And so all of his art has this psychological dimension in the early 1930s. And it's painted for somebody that if you do read Freud's interpretation of dreams, you get about a third of the painting already without knowing anything about Dalí's own stories from his own biography. Some of the examples of this, Dalí starts to take either personal images that he has a personal fear of and turns them into repeated symbols, or he'll employ a Freudian symbol and turn it into something that's uniquely Dalínian. One of the stories from his childhood, which may be completely apocryphal, we really don't know, is he says that at some point in his childhood he went from loving grasshoppers to being terrified by them. And he has a very elaborate story, which sounds like a dream story, about picking up a fish that had a particularly disgusting kind of surface to it, almost gelatin-like. And when looking at the face, he saw the hallucination of a grasshopper head. Immediately, he said he was filled with revulsion and nausea. And from that day forward, he says he feared grasshoppers. So suddenly we see in many paintings references to grasshoppers as a symbol of aberration and horror that you would only know by reading Dalí's own interpretation of his past. And it sounds very dreamlike. Another image which comes directly from Freud is the image of the lion. It's another image that appears in many Dalí paintings. On the one hand, Freud says that wild beasts like lions represent passionate, repressed impulses which just erupt in the dream and cause terror for the individual. For Dalí, there was actually an image, which I don't have here, that hung over his bed that had had a lion in it. He said that as a child, he developed a particular fear of that image, and he starts to repeat lion images in his paintings after 1930. So we have a number of different, terrified beasts. And then he makes the second step, which is he associates it with his father. Father is cannibal. Father is looking to destroy his son because he has a falling out with him just before joining the Surrealists. Ants have an element of shock value. Dalí uses them over and over again for that sense of disgust and horror, but they also have an association with sexuality and with arousal. So they work as a Freudian sexual element, but also as just an image of horror that seems to be unleashed in the dream state. And finally, I mentioned about the piano. When Dalí was young and spent summers on the beach, there was a family next door that would have summer concerts out on the rocks along the water. They would bring their piano out onto the rocks and actually have a concert with chamber music. And Dalí remembers these vividly with a great sense of enthusiasm, but at the same time, he also associates the piano with these books that were left by his father about venereal disease. And so you have this really strange, dreamlike experience of a piano outside in the environment, but then also these associations with sexuality and fear. So whenever you see these pianos, there's a number of things coming from Dalí's past that he's associating with them. And then, of course, slightly different from the dream context, but looking at mythology, Dalí was a great remythologizer. He was a person who could take his own personal life and create elaborate mythological edifices out of particular stories that related directly to him. One of the key stories is that he has a terrible falling out with his father. It was building over his entire youth. His father was a very powerful figure with very short temper. Dalí was a very timid, thin, kind of weak individual who was at the same time very witty and very much liked to constantly egg his father on until finally his father would explode. Eventually, his father explodes too much, and they fall out, and they don't speak to each other for 5 years. And this becomes a time when Dalí becomes the perfect Oedipal child. It's like he's living the Freudian story of Oedipus, where there's the father-son struggle, somehow related to the mother, but more just the idea of the battle. Dalí paints a number of paintings about the father figure. This gentleman in the painting in our work, The Average Bureaucrat, does not look like Dalí's father, but represents the father. And you can see, just like the De Chirico we saw earlier, no shirt, nothing dressing him. He seems very much naked and open to the world. He's also disconnected from us, just as the De Chirico figure was. He's not looking at us, his eyes are closed. And plus, to make things worse, he does not have ears, so he's not listening to us. So as a father figure, this is a very dysfunctional image of that. And then take it one step further and turn it into a crazy comedic interpretation of the same sort of horrific figure. This is the Enigma of William Tell. What's really unique about this painting is it's 13 feet long. Unlike every other painting we have in our galleries upstairs, except for those large masterwork pieces, this painting was the one and only large canvas of his Surrealist period. But it is 13 feet long, so that's about a 6-foot buttock, just to kind of get you into that image set. Clearly, concerns about impotence, the phallus buttock that's being supported by the crutch, and then the father-son struggle, where here the father, in the guise of Lenin, one of the father figures to the Surrealists, is embracing his son, but also about to devour him. So there's that fear of cannibalism and destruction that the father wants to do away with his son. And then finally, another piece from our collection, which takes us right to the end of the Surrealist period, 1940. This is the Three Ages of Man, which relates to the same obsession Freud had with the riddle of the Sphinx. Oedipus is the one figure who is able to unravel the Sphinx's riddle, which is, what is it that walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? And the answer is man who crawls on all 4s as a child, walks upright on 2 as an adolescent, and then finally, in old age, needs a crutch or a cane to offer support. So even though this is this paranoid critical double image that Dalí has developed very consciously, he's also talking once again about the Freudian Oedipal complex and part of the story that's not always directly in the middle. This is more the idea of mystery, the riddle that's contained, that the Sphinx holds very close to her. And then just to kind of close this idea about Dalí in relation to Freud, in 1938, as many of you are aware, as a matter of fact, there was, of course, the play Hysteria at American Stage, which dealt with just this very incident. In July, Dalí had the final opportunity to meet this great father figure hero to him. So in 1938, he goes to London, and he had tried to meet Freud 3 times in Austria, and for whatever reason, it kept going awry. Finally, he has this chance to meet his hero. Of course, in 1938, Freud is very, very elderly. He was born in 1856, so this is the very last year of his life. He's had a lot of problems. A lot of his jaw has been removed at this point because of cancer. And so he quietly allows for Dalí to come in and visit him. Dalí brings this particular painting, which is one of his greatest paintings, dealing with metamorphosis and transformation, and also self-love. Narcissism is one of the key ideas in this painting. And he wants Freud to see the painting, but more importantly, Dalí has written an article about paranoia, and he wants Freud to see him as a great student thinker of psychology, of psychoanalysis. And so, although he's got the painting, he wants Freud to pay attention to the article. Freud's just interested in the painting. You know, the article to him doesn't care, doesn't pay attention to it. This, of course, leads Dalí to become a little more frustrated. But just prior to that, Freud makes a comment about Dalí's paintings. He says, in your paintings, and this is from Dalí's own writings, so we don't know if this is really said or if this is a paraphrase. We assume it's a paraphrase. It's a very interesting comment, but Freud basically offers the insight that in your paintings, the unconscious seems to be, you know, sort of secondary. It's really the conscious mind that seems to be at work. He says in older artists that he had always been fascinated by, people like Leonardo da Vinci, the thing that seems mysterious or troubling is that idea, the unconscious idea, that hidden, enigmatic order. But he says that in Dalí's paintings, possibly because Dalí is so familiar with psychoanalysis, it seems that the painting is simply a mechanism to reveal these ideas. And so Dalí takes that as being a statement not only about his own work, but about surrealism in general. And one of the interpretations is that that statement allows Dalí to move past psychoanalysis and move towards what eventually becomes Catholicism and Dalí's obsession with science. But Freud also says to a friend of his later, he said that young Spaniard you introduced me to with those candid, fanatical eyes and that undeniable technical mastery has really made me change my feelings about the surrealists. Because until this point, he thought the surrealists were just nuts, you know, and perhaps rightly so. But he goes on to say that it would be interesting to investigate analytically how that young artist actually came to create the work. And so finally, returning back to the meeting, Dalí wanting Freud to read this, wanting him to acknowledge him as a great future psychoanalysis student, he gets more and more frustrated, and he starts flailing about more and more frantically trying to get Freud to read it, that eventually Freud comments to his friend, you know, I've never seen a more complete example of a Spaniard. That person was such a fanatic. And so he appreciated what Dalí brought to him. He was actually engaged by the meeting. But it seems like from Dalí's point of view, there was a sense of not disappointment, but definitely frustration, that this one part of what he wanted him to acknowledge never happened. And very shortly after that, Dalí's forced to come to the United States, and he starts writing his autobiography, which really does form in his life almost this split between the former Freudian approach to the world and a less Freudian, more scientific, modern science, nuclear mysticism kind of approach starts to begin. 1945, and I'm just about ready to step aside, the atomic bomb is dropped. Dalí's work becomes quite different. And many of the surrealists are now in exile in the United States. And this is really important because what happens is all of these American artists who are starting to try to define themselves, trying to figure out where they are, suddenly all their heroes are here on the same block. You know, they're seeing them at the galleries. And it gives the American artists a much more sense of significance and understanding of what the Europeans were about. And this is really where Carl Jung appears in the art historical story, because Carl Jung suddenly becomes the psychoanalyst for this next generation. The Surrealists were showing this young American generation about how process and automatism and free process-oriented image making was a very important part of one's psychology. They got so interested in this, and also the dropping of the atomic bomb changed everything, that they really moved completely away from representational images. And what they really connected with was the idea of the kind of the violence or the psychic disposal of different ideas that they had, to where something like William de Kooning's image of woman number one becomes much more about the psychic phenomena of the paint being applied to the canvas than it does to the particular image. And same with Jackson Pollock in this very beautiful lyrical piece from 1950, an overall expanded canvas which is kind of danced onto the canvas through pouring of the paint on the floor. This becomes much more of a kind of a Jungian exploration of the unconscious and the unconscious impulses and certain archetypal ways of thinking about it. That's very, very radically different than the kind of Freudian sexual obsessions that certainly show up in Dalí's work and the work of his colleagues from the 1930s and 40s. And so with that, I am going to step aside and invite Velva up to talk about Carl Jung and his way of fitting in with Dalí and with Freud. So thank you.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm so happy you're here. This is a really exciting time for me because ever since this building has been built, I've been thinking about Dalí and dreams and Jung and Freud. And I'm a Jungian for many, many, many years. So I always, when I looked at the art, I always looked at it a little bit differently than how it was interpreted. And I always thought, well, listen, there's another way to look at this. And so I decided, Peter and I talked one day, and I said, how would you like a Jungian perspective? And so here we are. So I hope you enjoy tonight. By the way, I must admit that this presentation got a life of its own. I had a synchronistic moment, which I'll share with you during the presentation, which changed my whole presentation tonight, including the title. But that's kind of cool because I thought, hey, if you can't do that at the Dalí, you can't do it at all. So, you know, I went with it. The overview is going to be the Jungian theory, the relationship between Jung and Freud, then Jung, Freud, and Dalí, because in my research, I realized how much these three fellows had in common. And it's a remarkable combination of psychodynamics that they all shared. And then I want to share a little bit of the Red Book with you. I did bring the Red Book with me tonight. We're going to set it up at the end of the presentation, and you can take a look at it. You're going to see some images from it, and I hope, you know, that you get excited about it and want to know more about Jung. Well, he was a remarkable man. During his writing of the Red Book, which was the result of his break with Freud, so we want to get into this father-son relationship because that was a powerful, powerful relationship for both of them. And when it ended, Freud fainted, and Jung went into retreat and wrote his Red Book. So that's kind of the purpose of the split, because the truth is, it had to happen. The son has to leave the father. And it can be a graceful parting, or it can be a rupture. In this case, it was a rupture. And there's all kinds of sensitivity of feelings around all these kinds of experiences. And so it's very difficult to get into every single detail. But because of that rupture, Jung went on to explore his own psychic. Jung became, in effect, his own patient through reflection, solitude and reflection. And that's when he came up with archetypes, the collective unconscious, complexes is a Jungian term, and synchronicity. And those are his four major contributions to the field of psychoanalysis. So we're going to talk a little bit about them because they're so important. They're the archetypes of the fundamental core concept that we all share. They're pervasive, they're repeatable, they're throughout ages and throughout cultures. They drive our beliefs and behaviors. We just don't know it. So this is another thing that we have to understand is much of what goes on in our behavior is we're unaware of. Jung's four primary archetypes were the shadow, and that's our unconscious dark side that we usually project elsewhere. We project it onto somebody else. The animus, the male energy within the female, and the female energy within the male. And then the self-individuation. In this case, Jung talks about self-individuation as the coming together of the conscious and the unconscious to create a whole. So when you see the word a lot in Jungian writings and everything, the word self with a capital S, it means that it's the self-actualized individual, the one who's done his work on himself, so to speak. The collective unconscious, according to Jung, is our psychological DNA. It comes, and by the way, this is one of Jung's paintings. It's a mandala. It's in his book. And we're going to see a lot of his paintings throughout this because one of the things Jung and Dalí had in common was art and the ability to express your unconscious through art. And you'll see that Jung, of course, is very different than Dalí because they were very different people, but they had a tremendous amount in common. So our psychological DNA, it's inherited. It's a pre-existing condition, if you will. And it resides in our deepest, deepest unconscious. And we all have it. We all share it. And that's one of the tenets of all his theories. And if you don't accept this collective unconscious, then it's very difficult to accept Jung at all and his theories. This is another one of his mandalas. So what are complexes? We've all heard the term. Complexes are unconscious patterns or memories, emotions, perceptions, wishes that surround a common theme. And one of the things Freud, Jung, and Dalí all had in common is they had a father complex. And that drove all their behavior. And you know through understanding Dalí as well as you do, and as well as Peter presented it tonight, everything was about his father complex. It becomes all-consuming for people, especially a complex of a primary love object. So a combination of emotions and impulses that have been rejected from awareness, but still influence a person's behavior. For example, we talked tonight about the edible complex. Certainly no young man is going to sit down and say, hey, I want to sleep with my mother and kill my father. But it's unconscious, and that's what the edible complex is. Complexes, they're not neither good nor bad. They're just part of our psychological makeup. But the results on acting on a negative complex can be very serious. They're extremely powerful. They drive most of our behavior. And the more we can understand them, resolve them, bring them out into the light, as they say, bring them out of our shadow and into our light, the more we can do that, obviously, the more healed we become, the more self-actualized we become, and the less they drive our lives. So the more deeply embedded and the more we reject and deny them, the more powerful they become. It's very paradoxical. So here are some beginning differences. Jung and Freud had a very different take on complexes. Jung believed in many complexes. He had 4 primary ones, but he believed in many. Freud just believed in the Oedipal complex. And that's where he ground to a halt, and there was no getting him off that dime. After their split, Jung changed the name of what he was going to do. He started his own professional group, and he changed it to analytical psychology. He wanted to avoid confusion and be completely separate from Freud, and he wanted to claim his own stake in the emerging field. Synchronicity, the experience of 2 or more causally unrelated events that come together in a meaningful way. So a connect between an external event and an internal event through a dream can be considered synchronistic. Now here's a Dalí image that is synchronistic. So there it is. everything comes together and creates a new whole. And it comes together seemingly by accident. But when you look at it, if you look at things more closely in your world, you're going to find there's a lot more synchronicity than you imagined. There's another synchronistic image. I thought this was very Dalí-esque, don't you? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story of my own synchronicity, and this is why I changed my presentation. It was very interesting working on this presentation during an election week, during the beginning of the 21-day meditation by Chopra. There was all these things going on in my world that started to come together. I had a dream. And all these things started to merge together, and I started to look at them, and I started to say, wait a minute. And I was able to step away from the presentation, and the dream was that I was doing this presentation and everybody left. And I equated it to the dreams we have in college, where you're sitting there trying to take a test and suddenly you have no clothes on. I thought, oh my God, why did everyone leave? And that morning I got up and looked at my presentation again, and I realized my dream was projective. In other words, I left my presentation. It wasn't about anybody else. This is dreams, they're all symbolic. And I looked and I said, no wonder I left my presentation, it's boring. I was doing the classic, and you saw some of it, didactic, telling everybody this, that, and the other thing. And I bored myself. So in my dream, I left. So, well, that's not good. So from that point on, I started, listen, let's get a little kooky, let's have a little fun, let's learn and hopefully enjoy in just a different paradigm. So that was my moment of synchronicity. The dream, realizing that these two men were at each other's throats trying to be president, realizing that Freud and Jung were at each other's throats trying to do this, realizing that everybody it's a week of conflict, and then the 21-day meditation comes, and I thought, hey, this is pretty cool. This will get me out of all this angst of the election. And then I had the dream. So go figure. Okay. You've seen this image before, but it's part of my presentation, and this is the professional bond. Now, this is where the fun begins. Now, the timeline, they met in 1900, 1907. They met in Vienna for 2 weeks, and that's the famous 13-hour conversation Freud and Jung had, which was the great merge of minds. And they became almost inseparable after that. Jung became Freud heir apparent. Well, there's clearly a transference going on. There's clearly a father-son relationship developing on both sides. Now, just as Dalí got offended when Freud didn't recognize his writing, Freud felt rejected when Jung gave a major lecture and didn't acknowledge him. He was very hurt. He wanted to be recognized by his heir apparent. So they argue after the lecture. Freud faints. Jung carries him to a couch, and they have this conversation, which was the beginning of the end, because Jung kind of minimized Freud's reaction to the lecture and the argument. So by 1913, their relationship was formally over, which had to happen, but it didn't have to happen the way it did. So the following images of Jung and Freud bonding were photoshopped by Jungian and Freudian therapists. And I imagine them doing this when they were bored and they were between sessions and everything. But all kinds of stories and myth grew up around these images. They're fun, but they're also good examples of Freudian wish fulfillment, and then good examples of Jungian archetypes. So let's see if you can spot the archetypes in the images. This is the kill bond, okay? Freud and Jung go off and hunt together, okay? This is the chill bond. Freud and Jung go off to a sauna, okay, to relax. This is the party bond. They're feeding each other drinks. This is the pool hall bond. This is my favorite. How do you like those clothes? This is the dating bond. They went double dating together. And of course, the ultimate bond is the travel bond. So the larger community that loves these two men and admires them and respects them, their heir apparents, they all want them to get back together, so they fantasize and they create all these images as if these two guys went off and did all these cool things together, these guy things, which unfortunately was not true. So their basic difference is a conflict of neuroses. Jung says, hey, it's an undeveloped part of our psyche we've ignored. Freud says it's a clash of instincts. Jung says individuation, transcendence, what I call life purpose and spirituality are the goal of life. Freud says it's resolving childhood conflicts, primarily Oedipal complex, or what we call the drive theory. His basic theory, we didn't get into it in the earlier part of the presentation. Peter is the ego, the id, and the superego. We all know that. And the 3 levels of psychological awareness. So this is a famous iceberg image that everybody uses when they talk about Freud, and then we always say it's always the tip of the iceberg. It's about what's conscious to us and what's unconscious to us. Jungian theory, once again, collective unconscious. It's a part of the psyche that's never been conscious, part of the psyche common to all human beings. Its contents are innate. They're not made up of personal experience. Jung has the collective unconscious and then the personal unconscious. And he's committed to that, and he composes all of them. They're all composed of archetypes. We went through archetypes, but I'm going to give you a better example of them, one that you can get your hands on. There's the family archetype. The father, the authority figure, the mother, the nurturer, the child. You have a dream of any of these, you can immediately start connecting the dots in your dreams. Birth, beginnings, innocence. A lot of people dream of suddenly, people will tell me, I had a child in my arms. And we use that as a symbol of what's going on with them unconsciously. What is deeper down there? And it's about the idea maybe that there's a new beginning and not in their life, in their way of thinking about life. Everything is internal. So I have this baby. Well, what do you think the baby represents? And we go down and we start teasing out the symbolic nature of having a baby, an infant, a child, in your dreams. The grandfather always represents the enduring masculine. The grandmother, the feminine wisdom, tolerance. The family or the tribe. Tribe has always represented safety, security, protection. The worst things that could happen is be banished from the tribe, right? It was sure death. There's the story archetypes. There's a million of them. Almost every book you read has one of these. They all have one or more archetypes in them. The hero, that's your detective novels. They're going to rescue somebody. They're going to champion a cause. The maiden, pure, innocent, sought after. The wise old man. Doesn't the hero usually have some old timer that they go hang out with to seek advice? The magician, mysterious, powerful. Earth Mother represents nature, support. Think of that. Think of always being supported. There's always earth under your feet. The witch or the sorcerer is dangerous. Beware. The trickster, the one that deceives and comes in, and there's a lot of fables around the trickster. Remember? The frog who hops a ride. Okay. Then we have animal archetypes. Animals appear in a lot of people's dreams. What do they mean? These are archetypes. They may mean something very different to the person who has the dream, because dreams are very subjective in nature. but unquestioning loyalty. Usually that's what we think of when we think of a dog. The enduring horse, never giving up, plodding on, getting the mail must go through. The self-serving, selfish cat. The snake, seductive and dangerous. The crafty spider, weaving creatively. Can you name some other animals that you associate with certain archetypes?
Pigs.
Pardon?
Pigs.
And what does it associate with? Okay. Anybody? Pardon? A fox is? Okay. Clever, sly, right? But a fox outfoxes himself. So, pardon?
Bird.
What kind of bird? Okay. Bird. Flight, freedom. Yes. Yes. So there's all of these different animals we associate, as archetypes. They symbolize something. The wise owl. So if they come in your dream, and if that is an archetype in your dream, you can stop and say, okay, what part of me is wise? Why is the wise owl appearing in my dream? What is the symbol? What does it mean? It's about, the dream is always about the dreamer. So you say, okay, what does that mean to me? And you do that, and you eventually dig down enough, and you will make an association. Now, if you've had an owl as a pet, or raised a baby owl when you were a child, then it's a whole different ballgame. Now, I'm talking about archetypes, not personal experiences. So the Jungian model, just to show you a little bit of visuals about it, it starts, obviously, collective unconscious to the anima and animus, the male, female energy that we all have, the shadow, what we bury, what we don't want to own, what we try to, lay off on somebody else, the subconscious, which is our memories, and the persona. We all have a persona. We have a persona when we get dressed and go to work. I had a persona coming here tonight. I'm going to go home and I'll have a different persona when I get home. You'll have a different persona on a date. Well, all our whole waking consciousness is us setting our personas. That's social, that's normal, there's nothing wrong with it, unless you become over-invested in a certain persona, like the macho man, for example, who's an archetype too. But you can become your persona, and then you've lost the rest of you. So that's never good. So the pop culture perspective. Freud says, tell me about your childhood, tell me about your Oedipal, which, by the way, never included young girls. So there's an issue right there. And then Jung says, tell me your dreams. When I started my quest on learning dream work, nobody said a word to me. I was psychodynamically trained at Loyola University. They use the psychodynamic model, the analytical model. I never heard the name Jung. Never knew he existed till I graduated, and somebody brought me a dream, and I had no idea of what to do with it. I actually said, why don't you find a book? And I shudder to think I said that, but I did, because I was totally ignorant about dreams. Then somebody else said, well, you can go to the Jung Institute in Evanston. All they do is dreams. I said, where? It was just so amazing that I had gone through all this clinical training and never knew Carl Jung existed, and never knew that dreams were such a powerful, significant part of a healing process. It's just, to this day, blows my mind. So 7 years later, I went to the Jung Institute for 7 years, left it with an incredible take on how to be a service provider or a healer. Went out of the clinical realm of service provision, medical service provision, to healing. And it get emotional when I think about it. Excuse me. Okay. I had another dream. And the dream does belong to the dreamer. And as I'm sitting here, I'm going to tell you about a different dream to make a point about the personal and the collective. This dream is in my book. It's a man came to me and dreamed that he had molested his niece. He was very upset. She was very important to him. And we sat down, and it took weeks for us to get to the bottom of this dream. And he began to describe her as tall, thin, with flaming red hair, and she was wearing this sort of transparent dress. So, of course, I said, "Is that how your niece looks?" He said, "Oh, no, she's kind of short and chubby. She's 12 years old. She's got zits. She's not sexy at all." And I said, "Well, has she ever flirted with you?" And he said, "Oh, my God, no. She's just a kid." So this whole thing became very, very problematic. So we kept working on it and working on it. I kept referring him back to the symbol. And as we worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, he began to be aware. Then he started talking to me about his addiction. He was a recovering alcoholic, and that he was coming up into 10 years clean and sober. He was very proud of that. And I know from being an addiction counselor that 10 years is sort of a red flag time. A lot of alcoholics will say, "Well, I'm clean and sober 10 years. I know that I can drink now. It's okay. I'm safe." So they kid themselves that way. So as we're talking about this image and this girl and this, he told me he used to drink in the basement. He'd sneak down and drink down there. And that's when he started smoking, too. So now I'm starting to connect a whole different set of dots. And I started asking him about drinking and smoking. And then I started asking him more and more questions. And I said, "Well, let's go back to this image now. If your niece isn't tall and thin," he insists it's his niece, by the way, and she was 12. He said, "I know it's my niece." I said, "Okay. So remember, it's a symbol. What is tall and thin and has a transparent white dress and flaming red hair?" And I actually semi-hypnotized him. I said, "Okay, close your eyes. We're going to do some deep work here." And he leaped up. He said, "Oh, my God," and he slapped his knee. He said, oh my God, it's a cigarette." It's a cigarette. And I was just, here's the end result. He was going to drink again. This was a relapse dream. He was thinking about drinking. And he had this dream which brought his niece, who was 12. He began drinking when he was 12. He began smoking and drinking together. And the symbolism of that cigarette was a relapse symbol. So he went back to AA. He reconnected with his sponsor. He didn't relapse. He went back and enjoyed his relationships with his brother and his niece and sister-in-law. That was a significant dream. It took a long time to get there, but if you're willing to dig, you can connect your own dots with things like that. Transference. We're going to get into the relationship between Freud and Jung and eventually Dalí, because it all hinges on transference. Everything about them, every single thing about all of them is about transference. Freud becomes dad. He's not dad. He's Freud. So you have to look at this. The key to relationship enmeshment, or imbroglio, or Gordian knot, or just plain mess, is transference. Now, in transference and psychological, the therapist usually gets the brunt of the transference issues, but anybody can get one. Emotions, desires associated with one person, such as a parent or a sibling, unconsciously shifted to another person, usually the analyst or therapist or counselor. This is my definition: the redirection of attitudes and emotions towards a substitute who triggers an unmet need or neuroses. You don't have strong transferences. You don't have them if the need is met. Transference occur when the need is not met and the child enters the world hungry for something. and it's usually a significant relationship, a caretaker, it's usually love, and they enter the world and they don't have it, and they constantly seek it. It's a quest, a never-ending quest, and it can be healed, it can be worked through, ideally worked through a therapeutic relationship. But have you ever met somebody you just didn't like? Or somebody that just ticked you off? Or somebody that immediately you liked? That's transference at work. You don't know those people. They're total strangers. And suddenly you have strong feelings about them, right? That's what transference is. It's illogical, unreasonable, but we all do it. So I think of when I wanted to put an image together that showed how this all started to play out with the three men, the Gordian knot, you know, so entangled, so enmeshed that it's almost impossible to untangle it and have it make sense. It's from a Greek legend. Alexander the Great was supposedly the first person that broke or slashed the Gordian knot, but it's used as a metaphor, really, for thinking outside the box in terms of problem solving. Shakespeare refers to it, turn him to any cause or policy, the Gordian knot, of it he will unloose, familiar as his garter. So we're going to do a little psychological profiling. I've been reading for months about Jung, Freud, and Dalí. And this is also part of the synchronistic experience. I was so focused on showing everybody what differences there were, I realized that there were more commonalities than differences. And that was very refreshing. I just wish our government could get on that page too, but that's another story. They shared very significant psychodynamics. The primary one was a father complex. All three men had it. They all experienced a developmental arrest. They all suffered from depression, which goes along with all of this other symptomatology. Each marched to a different drummer. They were able to think outside of the box. They were brilliant thinkers. They were all fathers of a movement. Symbolism was key to their self-expression. They all viewed and expressed life through dreams and unconscious material. All of them cut their own Gordian knots. Freud not so successfully, unfortunately. And each attempted to heal through professional choices. Now we have self-healing. We have Jung and Freud through science. They both were doctors. They were trained in their respective institutes in Europe. But Jung and Dalí healed through art and creativity. And Dalí attempted his healing through creativity. So we have this enmeshment of these three figures with all these commonalities, trying to struggle and work through getting their needs met, their unmet needs from childhood. And that's what we all do, and that's why people wind up in therapy. And once they're met, you can move on. Once Jung and Freud had their falling out, it was the rupture that was appropriate to a father-son relationship. The son is never going to leave home if he doesn't have the clash with the father. The resolution of the Oedipal requires two things. And there's two Oedipals. The first one, 4 or 5 years old, let's say the little boy looks at his father and he sees this big, strong figure. He says, I want to marry mom. How many people have had their kid, propose marriage to them? I have. A lot of little boys say, oh, Mom, I want to marry you when I grow up, The kid looks at the father and says, uh-oh, this guy's too big. But when the child gets older, when the second Oedipal opportunity, the idea to win the Oedipal is to fail the conflict. The reason sometimes it doesn't work is because the mother is sending signals to the son, or the parental relationship is ruptured, and the mother and the father are not getting along that well, so there's an illusion that you could stand a chance if you can just get in there take mom away from dad. Now remember, this is all unconscious. But the idea of winning the Oedipal is surrendering to the love that your parents have and then finding a woman like your mom. Like the song said, I want a girl just like the girl that married their old dad. That's the resolution. But when it doesn't happen, when you get stuck there, you yearn and you leave, you never really move psychologically beyond that point. It becomes your defining moment in your life, as you saw with Dalí. So the way Jung cut the Gordian knot was to isolate himself after his split with Freud and begin to write the Red Book. I have it with me and you can see it. He began to untangle his knot after the break with Freud in 1913. He did so by undertaking the book. He called it the voluntary confrontation with his unconscious, and he became his own patient. Jung's art expresses his struggle with the numinous. The numinous means the experiences we have within that we can't articulate, that we have to express in a different way. You can't articulate them verbally. And it took him 16 years to complete it. Now, by the way, he wrote 26 volumes, all of which I had to read when I was at the Jung Institute. So he wrote the Red Book as his process, but then once his theory became solidified in his mind, he proceeded to write 26 volumes and many, 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 many other books. The Red Book's divided between the original and English. It was closely guarded by his family for until 2010. It records the evolution of his theory. It's beautiful. I saw it. I went to New York when it came to show at the Rubin Museum. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's on parchment, and it's got this fabulous thick red leather cover, pebbly. And I met the man who translated it into English. It was a thrilling time. Jung says, the years when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Now, he's saying the same thing as Dalí is saying. Do you see how they reflect each other? Everything else is to be derived from this. Everything later was merely the outer classification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. In other words, this whole process is churning away and churning away and churning away. He's internalizing it. He went through a terrible time after he and Freud split. Some say he had a psychotic break. Some say he didn't really, but he was close to it. Nobody knows for sure. But the end result was this outpouring of art and process. But the numinous beginnings, the ones he couldn't articulate, they contained everything. So I'm going to show you some of his art, and you'll see how symbolic it is and how much it could mirror Dalí's work. I believe there's 58 images in the Red Book. Now look at this. Could not Dalí have painted it? So we're going to do a little more profiling. Jung and Dalí chose the creative arts to slice their Gordian knots. The primary difference between the two men was their psychological type. It's another thing Freud didn't believe in. But the truth is, Dalí was an extreme extrovert. He was probably narcissistic. I'm comfortable saying that. But he was okay showing up in a dive suit. Jung was an acknowledged introvert. He slunk off into he had a little retreat, and that's where he did all his writing. He was very, very low profile. So Dalí would publicly display himself as art, and Jung cloistered himself away and created the Red Book. both doing the same thing. One's an introvert and one's an extrovert. They're mirroring each other. I thought that was so interesting, and I always imagined, here I say at the bottom, it's interesting to imagine them meeting. There's no record that they ever did, but I think it would have been wonderful had they met. I think it would have been healing for Dalí. I really do. And I think Freud would have had a happier life. I read this incidences around his death and how, because he was such a strong father figure, none of his disciples, including doctors that treated him, would tell him he had cancer. They pretended it was some minor thing in his mouth. His father figure was the undoing of him in a very tragic way. And he didn't seem to have a community of, and he was an atheist. I think that didn't help because he didn't have a spiritual community. So all these things sort of contributed to his unhappiness at the end. And I really had a lot of sad feelings about his life and how it evolved, considering how it could have been. Let's say the rupture had been friendly. Well, it wouldn't have been a rupture then. Let's say the parting had been friendly. They could have helped each other. Freud was reluctant to tell Jung his dreams. He was guarded. He was protecting himself. Matter of fact, his therapeutic treatment model, and he admitted this, was a way to protect himself. That's why he would sit out of the patient's view. He didn't want to connect. And so that was more isolation on his part. I think one of the greatest things in my therapeutic process was having a connection with my clients, especially when you're seeing somebody 5, 6, 7 years. You're bound to have a connection. You keep your therapeutic persona, your professional persona, but you do have a connection. So, and you spend a lot of face time together, whereas Freud would never face a patient. So I felt very bad. I really did. This was a tragedy that didn't have to be. So when Jung became more and more and more accepted in this country, the movement about therapeutic healing, soul work as they call it, there was a wonderful article in Time on him, and I just wanted to put the cover here for you. This is Dream Mama. That's my alter ego. I wanted to show you Dream Mama. And she's been very helpful in helping me continue to work with dreams, look at dreams, understand dreams, create my own theory on dreams. I do have my own theory, and that's in my book. So to plug myself, the book is called The Dream Belongs to the Dreamer, and it's a hands-on how-to, step-by-step guide to understanding your dreams, and it will put me out of business. But that's okay, because I'm semi-retired, and that's okay. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I have no idea of what time it is. I've lost track of things. But are there any questions at all? I have to admit that, could you speak up?
You like the film Dangerous Method with Freud and Jung.
The Freud Jung movie, Dangerous Method.
I never saw it. I know the whole story. I've known the whole story for years, and Sabrina Spielbein, and I know none of them were lovers. I know that. And she went back to Russia and became an outstanding therapist in Russia. So that's what Hollywood, you know.
Dalí's mother died when he was 18 years old. So how do you think this had an effect on his break with his father? Because 2 years later, his father married the mother's sister or his aunt.
Well, there's all this incestuous stuff going on in all their relationships, everybody. It was not good. But back then, well, you know, it's perceived by the child. You know, I'm not Dalí. I can't speak for him. But I know that intermarriages like that stir up a lot. I know that Freud fell in love with his stepmother. She was 20 years younger than her husband, closer to his age than hers. Jung was molested as a child by his uncle. So there's all this sexual energy flying around, and a lot of it is shadow material. I can't speak to how he felt, but the damage and the father complex occurs, and the Oedipal complex occurs far before he's 18. So I don't know if that's a good answer. Well, sure, it's a little more, you know, you can build a case against anyone. When you're stuck in the father complex or the mother complex, you can build a case every single day against that person. They can't do anything right. And that's another symptom of this kind of a complex. No matter what they do, it's not right. So you have these complexes, they play out and they dominate everything. And they lend to what we call the rules, myths, and legends of your life. I did a program for years on just rules, myths, and legends. It was a hard program, but a lot of people were able to finally work through some of their antiquated beliefs. A common one for women is don't have sex before marriage. If you do, the man will never marry you. I mean, that's a myth. Never is a big word. A lot of women had sex before marriage and married the man. So, you know, if your life is ruled by these beliefs that have a false value to them, you know, you're not free to make your own choices. This is all about individuation. Jung's theory is all about growing up, getting a life, doing your thing, self-actualizing, you know, going out into the world and doing your thing. James Hillman was one of Jung's, one of Jung's, he ran the Jungian Institute in Zurich before he died. He tells the story of the young man who leaves the family and goes to California and meets a woman. This man has left the family to start a life of his own. He goes and meets a woman in California, falls in love, calls his mother and says, "Guess what, Mom, I'm in love, I'm getting married." And the mother says, "Well, how will she fit into the family?" You know, it's that to succeed with all these developmental stages, and there's 8 of them, by the way, you have to succeed and move through each one of them, and your parents need to help you. If you cling to your child, you're not helping them. If you overprotect your child, you're not helping them. You have to be able to let go. And it's very hard sometimes, especially if a child's troubled or not well. I mean, sometimes it's impossible. But you have to do that. When it's time to go, it's time to go. And the person has to find their drift. Half my clients change careers midway through therapy. They were all doing something that their parents wanted them to do. Some of them were doctors. They hated it. But they wanted to please their parents. When you get to the point where you have to please your parents so much you chose a career to please them, then you haven't self-actualized. You haven't individuated enough. You're still stuck in that parental pattern. And that's what Jung was very invested in. Hey, the Oedipal's fine. He never argued with that. Yes, we have these sexual feelings. Yes, we have to work them through. Yes, we have to, you know, deal with them through adolescence. But what about the rest of your life? And that's where he and Freud had these conflicts. What about the rest of your life? And that's what he devoted himself to. Getting on with your life, separating, individuating, finding your purpose, being okay within your own skin, loving yourself, liking yourself, being content with yourself. Let's not get too dramatic. Hey, I'm okay. Somebody asked me, I just want to make a little story because somebody asked me something professionally, and I gave them a thorough answer. And they said, well, is there an expert that I can call? And I'm looking around, And I finally said, other than me? Hey, wait a minute. I'm 73 years old. I've been doing this for 30 years. I had a whole life before I did this. I think I've got some experience. But what's funny to me was that because, and I'm sure there's experts in this room on every conceivable subject. But we come here, we semi-retire to Florida, we schlep around, you know. Everybody thinks I'm a photographer. I mean, it's a hobby. But I'm just saying that, you know, I laughed, but I thought, hey, wait a minute, I'm not putting out that persona, you know, that clinical professional persona. So, of course, I'm not seen as the expert. But bring me back to Chicago, and it's a whole different story.
So this may be an unfair question, but as a Jungian therapist, what's your, kind of back and scratch pad analysis of Dalí?
Well, he was clearly had a father complex. He clearly was, you know, narcissistic. So he had a character disorder. The very damaged guy. He needed to be healed. And he attempted to heal himself through his art, and I think that's wonderful. But I think he could have used a little help along the way. But he fell in love with Freud. Freud became the father figure. They resonated, they mirrored each other. And that was that. He never went any farther. When the rupture came, he was old enough to handle it. Do you know what I mean? When he and Freud... When Dalí went to Freud's house with his writing, his scientific writing, and Freud basically rejected him. And that's the father rejecting the son. But he was old enough, and I think confident enough and healed enough at that point to be able to handle that record. And then he went off and became a Catholic. I mean, let's put it a different way. He went off and found God. So he found a higher authority figure. And I'm sure that was very healing for him. I'm sure it was. I'm not kidding. But what do? I mean, you show up and, you know, this is your father figure and they reject you. What do? You either crumple or you go on. The same with Dalí and, Jung and Freud. This love affair they had, this man affair, that, you know, they just was incredibly enmeshed. And then once Jung got mature and matured into his own theories and own thinking, and he knew that there was more to life than the Oedipal, and they knew they eventually had to separate. You know, does that answer help you?
I was wondering if Dalí tried to heal himself through art, if he had healed himself, as you said, he was on his way, or
Yes.
tried to accomplish it. Let's say he did heal himself, he found a good Jungian therapist, and he healed himself. Would that have affected his art? Would he have stopped painting, do you think? Or
No, I think he would have painted differently. There's a big movement in the art field that if, you have to be a little crazy to be a good artist, and that if you get your act together, suddenly you're not an artist anymore. There's a belief, there's a lot of artists that won't seek therapy because they're afraid they're going to lose their artistic touch. That hasn't been my experience. So there's a myth there. I don't know where it started. Maybe it happens with some people. But Dalí, and all the artists transform. Every artist I've ever seen over time has transformed as they matured. Don't you agree?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, Andrea?
I was convinced that Dalí was interested in me, so I was connected really to that one. He was using his art to purge some of these horrible things that he was repressed in to keep light in culture, more religious and more iconic.
And we do have to remember one thing. Dalí always had Gala. And that was his, I don't know what would have happened if she'd have left. So I think her leaving would have been much more impacting on his art than he and Freud not hanging out anymore together.
Was Dalí familiar with Jung's work?
No, as far as I know, they didn't. No, I read and I followed all these links online.
any of the biographies, they all, if you go through the index, Jung's really not even there. And it's even...
It was a Freudian world back then. And God loved Freud. He opened up the door to a whole nother level of awareness and healing for people. He just, I don't think, took it far enough. But that's what Jung did and all the other practitioners. There's all these movements today. And they each have their own merit. The cognitive behavior model you had a couple weeks ago, that's the great get sober model. Don't drink, go to meetings. Realize something, act on it. It's a good model.
We hear that Dalí would access his unconsciousness by starting himself or hallucinations and that sort of thing. Do you know how Jung?
I'm going to need a mic back there.
Oh, the question was, we know that Dalí had certain ways to sort of jumpstart his exploration of the unconscious, to have access to dreams or to those things that make them vivid. How did Jung access his either unconscious or dream imagery? Was there a process that he had to get access to?
His process, yes. His process was the Red Book. Once he suffered that rupture, psychological rupture, and isolated himself, he began writing. And that's his writing. He became, like I said earlier, his own patient. And he became an expert on himself. He was very introverted, very insightful. He was very, very bright. He was very well trained. So he could detach and look at himself and say, okay, what's going on here and what's going on there and why am I looking at this and why am I feeling this? And he was able to connect all the dots for himself. So his process was the Red Book. Or in other words, let me put it in our lay terms today, journaling. I swear, if every client I ever recommended journaled, I wouldn't have had a practice anymore. I mean it. Journaling is incredibly therapeutic. So Jung had his Red Book. You guys go out and get your green, yellow, purple, orange, pink books and journal your heart out. Yes?
Are any of the paintings and or images in Dalí's paintings literal captures of his dreams? Other than, oh, I saw this chair flying in the sky in this dream.
That's even Freud couldn't answer that one. So I'm not even going to attempt that.
So there's real strong images, and I just remember the image and not the context of the image.
Yeah. Well, one nice thing about art is we can all project ourselves onto it. Excuse me. So, yes.
Actually, I have a question for Peter. When Dalí went to visit Freud and he brought his narcissism, did he give it as a gift to Freud?
No. It was show and tell time. It was one article, one painting. Look at me. I'm your greatest disciple type of meeting. And so it seems like Freud probably enjoyed the meeting, but given the period of time, the amount of pain that he was going through every day, it seems that Dalí probably was not as conscious of Freud's disabilities as he was with his own need to be recognized. And so probably another person experiencing the same thing would have been incredibly satisfied that they had just this opportunity. But for Dalí, so much rested upon it that it seems that it was still seen in some ways as a bit of a failure.
And if you can imagine what he's thinking and planning and imagining as he's on his way to meet Freud, he is full of fantasy about what it's going to be like, what Freud is going to say to him, what he's going to say back. He's probably got a million conversations going in his head. He's excited. He's finally meeting his father, the one who understands him, the one he's followed all these years. It's too big. It's too big. I'm sure he wasn't even aware that Freud was in pain. And Freud was in incredible pain. Incredible pain. But he was so invested. That's another thing about narcissism. You can't make that connection. You can't say, oh God, he looks like, if somebody grimaces, you don't even notice it because you're so caught up in your own drama. So I don't see him I see him having his fantasy unmet. But if he'd have entered with reality, it might have been a whole different story. Reality would have been, this man is very ill. I'm going to show up. I want to meet him, but I'm not going to take a lot of time because I know he's ill.
He actually did a series of sketches, so that would have, even in and of itself, taken time, which
Yeah.
probably made it all the more awkward or uncomfortable for Freud.
Yeah.
So, not a quick visit.
So I don't know if that's a helpful answer. But remember, it's all in your head. It's all fantasy.
You said people on Dalí's people on paranoia available.
It is, and it may even be possible to locate it online, but for a period of time, there were several books out that translated all the early writings into English, and all of them have gone out of print. So there's nothing to point to right now that in our store where you could see it. But I do believe, well, certainly the French one's still available. If you could read it in French, you can still find that in libraries. But it's around. It was done in 1934, and it was about his belief in paranoia in relation to the Angelus painting by Mallet.
Can you dim the lights for a minute? Because I want to formally end.
Let's see.
I think we're done. We're good, right? We're good. Thank you. Thank you. But a lot of people ask me why I left the psychodynamic world and became a Jungian. And this is my best answer. I heard as if I had no ear until a vital word came all the way from life to me, and then I knew I heard. That's my answer. Thank you.